Class is back in session. If you watched my primer on item design in Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, you know how exciting it can be to upgrade a piece of gear. But depending on who you ask, how an item looks may be even more exciting than the stats on the item. On the other hand, maybe you're like this guy and you just don't care if you look like a fool at all. And that's fine, but I'll be the first to admit that I've had my moments of vanity, and I think most people can relate to that, at least some of the time. So that's what we're going to tackle today in this video. Let's begin.
This is BazgrimTV. Learn, laugh, level up.
Welcome back. This is part 2 of a 3-part miniseries where I cover pretty much everything there is to know about loot in Pantheon. So if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button now if you want to stay up to date with all the latest and greatest Pantheon information, because that's exactly what I'm dedicated to doing. I have a lot more videos coming your way, and I want you to always be in the loop. And like I said in the intro, today we're talking about item appearances. You can probably tell from any one of the Pantheon streams that the developers have settled on what they refer to as a believable fantasy aesthetic. So that means that there won't be those huge, oversized shoulder pads that could hide small children in them, or weapons so unrealistically large that they must be overcompensating for something. But that also means that there finally will be a game that doesn't have dudes playing as females running around in those skimpy chainmail bikinis. Female characters in Pantheon, quote, will be very attractive, heroic in appearance, a persona anyone could look up to, but they will not be overly sexualized, end quote. Art direction like this really is just a matter of opinion. And let's face it, this is not a case of whose opinion is better than the rest. Some people like the cartoon look. Some people like the sexy look. Some people like sexy cartoons. That's all fine. There's already plenty of games out there that can offer that. But for this discussion, the fact of the matter is that Pantheon has already established this believable fantasy or realistic fantasy aesthetic. So with this aesthetic in mind, I think the next question to ask is, will the appearance of your gear reflect the power of it? Because, like I said, in some ways, finding a new item that looks cooler than your previous one is in some ways just as much, if not more, of a reward than the increase in stats. But are they connected? As you may remember from the first video in this series, creative director Chris Joppa Perkins provided the answer to a lot of these questions back in the March 2018 Pantheon newsletter in an article titled Armor 101. Quote, "We want players to feel a genuine sense of rags to riches in Pantheon, and so we want to be thoughtful about how quickly we roll out higher tier armors. So yes, you should be able to tell how high level someone is just by looking at them. That's the goal. I also want to make an important point that while we are creating these armors in sets, this doesn't mean everyone will always be in a matching set of armor. Quite the contrary, I would expect. Putting together a full matching set of armor will be a rarer accomplishment, and just because pieces may look the same doesn't mean each piece is part of the same set. At lower levels, it will be the norm to see players in more of a mismatched ensemble of gear, since they're using whatever they can get their hands on without the luxury of going after specific pieces beyond their level range. And so part of the rags to riches equation will be seeing higher level players getting closer to a matching set look, unquote. And that brings up an important point about the recognizability of items, whether it be something simple like a bronze helmet or something more rare. In order for you to be able to tell what someone is wearing just by looking at them, those items would of course have to have unique and distinct appearances, and that appearance eventually kind of becomes part of that item's identity and personality, which, as we learned in the first video, is an essential part of Pantheon's item design. So let's hear from Chief Creative Officer Brad Eridoun McQuaid about what his plans are for this.
Well, you know, with an MMO like this, there's going to be, thousands, if not tens of thousands of items. So there obviously can never be a one-to-one ratio between what you're wearing and how you look. That said, there'll be as many as we can fit in, both by launch and after launch, because it is very important to us, as we mentioned earlier, with that, seeing higher level people, that what you're wearing does show off what you've accomplished, how high level you are, what adventures you've gone on to inspire others.
Let me give an example of this. In a clip in the first video of the series, Joppa used a hypothetical example of an item called the Flaming Sword of Sovereignty. Now, let's say the Flaming Sword of Sovereignty lives up to its name and is really hard to get. You've heard people talking about it, and it's the only weapon in the entire game that has flames shooting out of it. So, if you're walking through town and you pass by someone carrying a sword that has freaking flames shooting out of it, you're gonna know exactly what you're looking at. You're also gonna know that that person must be pretty awesome, and they've made that dangerous journey to that one place and killed that difficult boss to get it. And maybe you even strike up a conversation with them about it. All just because that item had a very recognizable appearance. Not only do these sorts of moments foster a sense of community by being conversation starters, but as Brad said, it's also just pretty inspiring to see something like that. And it makes you want to keep playing, so that you too can eventually become powerful enough to go kill that boss and get that iconic weapon, and then show it off and feel rewarded by it. And then you inspire others to keep pushing themselves to advance. Because if you really get down to it, that's what the game is all about. But as you probably know, the races of Terminus come in many shapes and sizes, and even though there will be some built-in limitations as to what races and classes can equip each item, how will these items still retain their visual recognizability regardless of who is actually wearing them? Quote, in general, it will just be a smaller or larger thing depending on your race. The armor model will not change whether it's a human or an ogre or a halfling wearing the piece. We chose to move away from connecting armor aesthetic to race because we want the item's own identity to be the iconic thing. When you see a particular breastplate, we want you to say, whoa, that's the cuirass of the Watcher, instead of that's an ogre breastplate. That being said, we do have the ability to use overlay textures in the armor materials to create the appearance of markings, scrapes, runes, bone, etc. to give certain items that racial or cultural flair, end quote. Also in the first video in this series, we learned that mobs will be dropping items that make sense for the type of creature they are. So, for example, you won't be getting any breastplates from rats. That also means that if you want a chance at looting armor, you'll have to go for the more humanoid type mobs. And when we think about this in the context of gear appearance and recognizability, it brings up yet another interesting question. If you would be able to loot a weapon or piece of armor from an orc, let's say, will that item be visible on the mob's character, even as it's just walking around waiting for you to cut its head off? Well, we can actually tell from the Pantheon developer streams that some mobs already do display some of the loot they're carrying, such as these guards in Black Rose Keep. Of course, I think it's understandable that little things, like rings and necklaces, won't be visible, but some items, especially weapons, certainly are. Which means that if, for example, there's a particularly desirable sword that a certain mob can drop, and you knew what that item looked like, you'd probably be able to tell just by looking at it, before you even attack it, whether or not you'd be able to loot it. Okay, brace yourselves, because now it's time for the really hot topic. Cosmetic gear. Let's say you're a good diligent student of Pantheon, and you're spending a lovely afternoon reading through the entire FAQ on the Pantheon website. And then suddenly, you come across this little doozy. Quote, cosmetic gear will also be available, with players selecting how they want to view your character by toggling between adventure and cosmetic, end quote. Now, at this point, it may be your gut reaction to be at least slightly concerned, and I think that's completely fair and understandable, because it seems to contradict everything I just said about item recognizability, right? Because what is cosmetic gear? It's some sort of item that has no effect on stats, it just alters the appearance or the skin of that item. So you can look like you're wearing a full suit of this awesome golden armor, when you're actually just wearing a loincloth. However, I think some more explanation is needed here. The key phrase here is the part about how players select how they want to view your character by toggling between adventure and cosmetic. But what does that mean? It means you have control over how you want to view the world. If it's important to you that you be able to see exactly what people are wearing just by looking at them, then all you have to do is make sure the adventure appearance mode is enabled. But if you are into cosmetics and you want to see everybody looking their Sunday best, then you can enable cosmetic appearance mode. And of course you can switch back and forth as needed. Let me use an example from the other perspective, because I think it's really important that we all understand this. Let's say you got a pledge package that includes a Tunic of the Ages. Because, by the way, it's important to note that none of these pledge rewards can be considered pay to win. They have no stats and are simply to prove that you've been in the community since the early days. So, even though we don't know exactly what the Tunic of the Ages will look like as of this video, we do know it'll be a unique appearance, so that months or years after launch, when people see it, they'll think, wow, that's a Tunic of the Ages, that guy has been around for a long time. But only if they have cosmetic mode turned on. Otherwise, they'll just see the statted gear that you're actually wearing. More details will be revealed in time regarding the UI and mechanics of how you actually equip these cosmetics, but based on what we already know now, this may actually be one of those rare cases where one relatively simple solution can actually satisfy both sides of opinions, because cosmetic gear, by definition, really does not have any impact on gameplay. So I think it makes sense that it should mostly be up to each person what they want to see. If you like cosmetics and you want to see them, go for it. If you don't like cosmetics and you want to be able to instantly recognize what people are actually wearing, you can do that too. And if you want to do both situationally, it's just a toggle switch away. Everybody wins. On top of all this, if you're still not convinced, community manager Ben Kilson-Walters clarifies this in a forum post. Quote, "We have made it very clear that cosmetic items will be earned in-game and within our game's lore and not easily available to everyone." End quote. So it really seems like the devs are taking a pretty balanced approach to this. I think it's way too easy to hear the word cosmetics and immediately associate it with some game that has just way overdone and ridiculous cosmetics. Because trust me, they're out there. But it doesn't have to be that way. Because if you're a fan of cosmetics, working to get an awesome, rare appearance item can feel totally satisfying and rewarding, which is important. And since all the cosmetics will still be based on lore, regardless of whether you're viewing the world in an adventure mode or cosmetic mode, you don't need to worry about seeing a bunch of people running around in chicken suits in Terminus. Alright, that does it for part 2. By now we've covered both item design and item appearances in Pantheon. So next up, it's time for the grand finale, epic items. I'll see you there.